Jack King and small northern towns. Jack King was born a junkie, screaming and crying and kicking as much as his little underweight body could. They took him away from Jane, his junkie mother, and weaned him off heroin. Jack kicked the smack habit before he was a week old. When Jane King tried to buy a house in a small redundant mill town in Lancashire, there was a petition went round the residents of the small estate to stop her from moving in. Jane was a junkie, and her hubby was doing 5 years for dealing. Alan didn't sign the petition. Alan was queer, with experience in gay rights activism. He preferred to judge people on his dealings with him rather than just going along with the crowd's distaste of what was, after all, just someone else's lifestyle choice. The residents' petition didn't stop her, and Jane moved into the corner house next to Alan. They became buddies, the junkie and the queer. Carl King, Jane's 8-year-old son, would call into Alan's after school if his mother wasn't home. Alan would feed him, give him dry clothes if he was wet, and let him sit by the fire drinking tea, listening to the radio. Manus took a bad beating in Belfast and took the boat again and called and stopped with Alan. Alan and Manus were old friends. They had shared shortages of money and food and tobacco. They accepted each other and showed respect and kindness to each other. Alan was weaning Rob, his junkie boyfriend, off junk. Actually, Rob didn't really fit the gay norm. If there really are such binary differences as hetero and homosexualities, then Rob looked to Manus like he would fall on the hetero side. He wasn't in the least effeminate or anything like that. But Alan was the first bit of tenderness or affection Rob had ever experienced, and okay, so now he was queer. And with Alan beside him, he was prepared to at least try to give up junk. Manus took a caravan up on a piece of land some freaks owned. His caravan wasn't much, but he didn't need much. A stove to cook on, a few pots and pans. He'd get water from Alan's. Coming out of Alan's with a water container, Manus went up the back entry past Jane's house. Manus had met her a few times, but today Carl, her eldest son, was stood by the back gate. Manus, can you go into my house? What for? My mummy's not well, she's depressed, and she's just lying on the settee. What can I do, Carl? Just go in. Manus went in. It was a bright sunny day, but inside the curtains were drawn and the gas fire was on. Jane lay on the settee with a blanket over her. Jack was just a bundle on a cot. Manus is here. Carl was delighted with himself. He was a big lad for 8 years old, but had that whipped dog look thing going, like he'd got slapped too often. Carl was pleased that he had managed to do something that his mother might like, and the boisterous, full smile filled his face. She did like it too. Manus rolled a spliff, and Jane had Carl make tea, and they sat there watching soap operas for a while. After a while, someone called and asked her to score Smackville. She took Manus with her for protection, she said. So they walked down the river and along a leafy lane and scored and got stoned. Manus stayed for dinner, and later, when Carl was in bed, Jane had a bath and Manus washed her back. Next morning, Jane and Manus were all bright and cheery. Endorphins and dopamines floating all around the place from sex and drugs. Heroin's such a lovely sweet drug when you take it at first. And sex too produces such beautiful feelings. Jane said she would give up smack, except she needed to keep herself functioning so she could look after her newborn and her eldest and keep paying the mortgage on the house. Manus said he could look after the kids if she really wanted to come off. And so it came about. Manus fed and washed the baby and got Carl out to school, and Jane lay there being sick and sweating the shit out. Manus got his hands on an ounce of hash and started selling tiny little bits. He made a little money on some hash. Manus was good with money. He didn't spend it. He plowed it back into business, and pretty soon they were doing well. Well, it wasn't all smooth sailing. People were always turning up asking her to score for them. It's hard to say no to something that's going to make you well when you're sick. And then, of course, you're going to be sick the next time someone calls, and so it goes. It was a strange situation for Manus to be in. He had never wanted to say no to drugs before. Now, all of a sudden, he was keeping it out. He got attached to the kids. Poor little fuckers were dependent on Manus, and Manus couldn't help but love them. Social workers called at the house because Jack was born a junkie, so they had to keep calling to see if he was all right. He was all right. Manus looked after him well. Jane was still visiting her hubby in prison, bringing him hash now thanks to Manus. And Manus always made sure she had enough to look after her hubby. Manus felt a little guilty about screwing with the prisoner's wife, but it didn't stop him. Jane had one of those tiny little dogs, miniature terrier or something. He was always humping this little cuddly toy. He would hump from one end of the room to the other. The cuddly toy never humped back, of course, but Tiny didn't seem too upset. It was a little disconcerting for the prim and proper social workers to see Tiny hump away across the floor without shame. Things were always happening to Jane to make her need a hit. Somebody upset her. The dog got run over. She would have sneaky hits and always needed more than him, even when they shared. She was sick and cranky when she wasn't stoned. One day, some bloke, George, turned up with stolen credit cards, and Jane went off on a spending spree, sold the goods, and had lots of what she wanted. Smack. She ditched Manus then, and he cried all night. His tears seemed more than a little foolish to him. Jane had a hubby, and it wasn't Manus. Their relationship had an end date before they started. That had even been part of the appeal for Manus, a back door, an exit clause. Manus wasn't fit for a happy ever after. But still he felt a loss and cried. He tried to fix it okay in his head. She was a fine woman who had had it hard all her life. Daddy left her. Mummy's boyfriends were jerks, lying drunk with their dicks out surrounded by dirty mags when she got home from school. Nobody decent anywhere around and lots of bad things happening. And she was a junkie. Junkies aren't good or bad, they're just junkies. They do what they have to do for junk. There, it was okay. She was really a decent woman. She just couldn't afford to put feelings for people above junk. Manus fixed it all in his head and managed to come to terms with it. He could accept the situation and get on with his life. She came up the next night. He was pleased to see her. He had missed the warmth of her body and now accepted it gladly. George came up the next day with lots of speed, and Manus whacked up loads and built a bender in the pouring rain while singing "The Heathen Bataille Won the War." Rain was not cold, and he wore no shirt and felt the elements on his naked flesh. George fucked off then, and Jane and Manus shared her bed again. The days passed in a haze of highs and come downs. They'll end struggles to overcome addiction, then the collapse and acceptance. There were funny days, like when the social workers called one time and Manus and Carl and Jack, who was now 3 years old, were wrestling and mock fighting, laughing their heads off. "Get him, Jack, get him," Carl would say. Jack would make a lunge for Manus's leg. This was the state they were in when the doorbell went. Carl on his shoulder and Jack holding his leg and Manus speaking through the glass front of the door to the two social workers because he didn't have a key and couldn't open the door. And the social workers were worried for the kids and more worried by Manus's broad Belfast accent. But the screams and yells from the kids were healthy, happy screams, and although they couldn't see clearly what was happening, they could see that whatever it was, it wasn't a bad thing. The social workers heard the news through other junkies that they dealt with, that Jane had an Irish itinerant living with her and trying to keep junk out of the house. On one of the healthy days, when they had just spent a week or so clean and they had that "I've broken the bastard's back" buzz going on because their bodies were no longer screaming out loudly that they needed smack, and they felt strong because they had gone through the crawling skin, twitching muscles and nauseating sickness of withdrawal, And look, now they could see the sunshine again, and endorphins could be produced in their heads again, and life was possible to live. And he had that wild, deranged look in his eye, like he had been through the fire and nothing could hurt him now. He was stronger than his addiction. He was strong. And he didn't have no clean clothes. And when someone knocked on the front door, he beat the kids off his back and shouted that whoever it was, they had to come round the back. And he wasn't wearing jeans. And he was wearing jeans, but no top. And so he threw on a tank top belonging to Nicky, which didn't do much more than cover his tits. And when he answered the back door, it was a skinny little white boy asking if the household had a TV licence. And they didn't. And Manus lied that they didn't have a TV. And you could hear the TV on in the front room. But all the TV licence man heard was Manus's loud, "I've just beat smack. And I'm looking after our kids. So watch my sides, I'm dangerous" voice. And the wild untamed look in his eyes. And the ludicrous tank top that gave him a bizarre transvestite effect. The poor little TV guy scurried off, apologising for having disturbed Manus. It was funny. The poor little squeaky clean straight guy and big bad transvestite terrorist Manus. Manus sold hash from Jane's back door. He sold it indiscriminately to anyone who turned up and asked. One night, two trendy young fellas in jeans and runners turned up and asked him if he could sell them some hash. For the first time ever, he stalled and said he had none, and then maybe he could try and get some for them, and then, no, it's too much hassle. There's too much law about it. Two young trendies couldn't help but laugh at that statement. The two young trendies were both undercover policemen. Manus wasn't sure about it, but he thought about it more than usual and said no in the end. It was a good job because they busted someone else who did go out and get them a quarter later that night, and Manus was pleased to have trusted himself. Manus struggled, and by strict money management, not smoking at all and not spending any money on anything bar necessities, and ploughing any small profit back into the business, managed to build himself up so that he was getting a few ounces at a time instead of one. One day, an old drunk turned up looking for a small piece of hash. The man was so drunk he could hardly stand. He babbled about a horse that was going to win a race with great odds. Indian Ridge, the horse was called. The man was so drunk, but there was a light in his eye when he spoke about the horse, and again Manus trusted his instincts. For the next 2 weeks, he scraped whatever pennies he could together. It was an effort to hide pennies from Jane, who would buy sweeties and pop and always needed any extra cash there was just to spend. But on the day of the race, Manus had a tenner stash. Jane and him were fighting as usual, but he took Jack uptown with him into the boogies and placed his bet, £10 on the nose. The old punters in the boogies looked at him, kind of funny, carrying this child complete with nappy pins and bottle, and he was unsure of the procedure, but he managed to sign the docket with one hand and hold Jack with the other, and he watched the race on the telly, and Indian Ridge came in first, and Manus went up and collected £100. That bumped a couple of ounces up to 4 ounces, and still left some over for loads of Guinness. Jane was rags that he had managed to scrape a tenner away without her knowing, and rags that he had gambled a precious tenner, but there was little argument about the result. Manus managed to bring the business up to £half a pound of hash they bought at a time, 8 ounces. Manus did his best, but Skag was never very far away. Playing the role of someone who was trying to keep heroin out of the house was new to Manus, but he played it well and with a certain amount of success. Jane was always weaker and resentful of what he was forcing her to do. The fact that she had asked him to take a job on was neither here nor there. They fought like cat and dog. He would carry her teeth marks on his shoulder till the day he died. She was a mad fucker, as they say. She smashed up the interview room in the police station when she was on crutches. The police spoke to her through the door, but none were brave enough to tackle her. She was a big, strong lass too, pretty and all that, but not slight of frame. One day, Manus and Jane went round the corner to buy a £half-pound of hash. Manus usually did the business, but this day they both went round. The deal couldn't be done right away, and it was agreed that either he or Jane would collect it in half an hour. Outside the dealer's house, Jane and Manus had a fight. She was going uptown for some stupid painkillers, which, as far as Manus was concerned, made you just as ready as smack. She threw the keys of the house towards him. They lay on the road. He was sick of this constant battle, sick of pills and powders and potions, and sick of playing the role of someone who stops someone else from doing what they want. He thought not to pick the keys up. True, he was attached to wee Jack and to Carl, but watching Jane and Manus fight all the time couldn't be good for the kids, any more than it was good for Manus or Jane, for that matter. Then there was always the comfort of a house, bricks and mortar, running water, an Armitage Shanks toilet, TV and comfy chairs. Still, were they worth it? And did you get the chance to enjoy them, or did you just suffer with them around you? Obviously, Manus decided to suffer in the comfy chair, for he picked the keys up and went round to Jane's on his own. Opening the door of the house, Manus saw two strangers. One sat in the comfy chair, the other stood in front of the fireplace. Manus realised instantly that they were police, and put his hand in his pocket, took out, put in his mouth a piece of hash, and swallowed. The cops saw nothing. They were jovial. They had broken in through the front window, which had been left slightly ajar. They said they'd seen Manus break in that way before. They'd found some road chains in the ashtray. They searched Manus but found nothing. Manus wanted them out of the house before Jane came back with £5. They asked who owned the road chains. Manus said he did. They took him to the station and charged him. It was illegal what the police did, breaking into the house like that, but Manus didn't want no grief and pleaded guilty. That was the way Manus figured it. Don't hassle the law and they won't hassle you. But it didn't work out like that. On the day he went to court, he was hungover, and considering the crime he had committed, the possession of road chains, the cardboard filters you put at the end of joints, he wasn't taking it very serious. Still, he hadn't meant to go into court hungover, but a friend got him drunk the day before, and the two of them stumbled in bits to the court buildings the next day. Manus's friend had his dog with him. They offended the clerk of the court, and the clerk of the court is the most important man in the court. He was a nasty piece of work too. He had no qualms at all about using his power to teach any paddies, packies, blacks, or just poor people their place. He had Manus's court hearing put back for a month, and during that month, he made it a condition of Manus's bail that he should sign on at the police station every morning at 9:30. Bank robbers, murderers, rapists, they normally might have to sign on at a police station, but the idea of making someone who had road chains in their house report every day to the cop shop was ludicrous. Manus had all the luck of the Irish under English rule. Plus, he had his friend's attitude, and his own attitude, and the clerk's attitude. The end result was Manus having a major black card against him. It was like the clerk told the cops to break this little cheeky piece of Irish scumbag. At least, that's what it seemed like to Manus. The cops had an attitude when he went to sign on to the police station. The Irish were bombing England at the time. Perhaps that had something to do with it as well. Manus was still looking after Jack. In the morning, he changed and fed him and got him dressed for nursery. One morning, as he pushed the pram to nursery, the heavens opened and the rain fell down hard and heavy. Manus pushed the pram into the shelter of a doorway and stood and waited. The shower lasted about 15 minutes, and both he and the child were damp and dishevelled. Jack would get a change of clothes at the nursery. Manus had to go to the cop shop. The shower had made him 15 minutes late, and he had been caught in another on the way from the nursery to the cop shop. So he arrived and stood dripping in front of the desk sergeant. Instead of letting him sign 15 minutes late, the desk sergeant got the assistance of another constable, and the two of them came out from behind the desk and physically manhandled Manus into a cell. They shoved him and pulled at him. They tried, quite obviously, to provoke a reaction from Manus. Manus did not react. Like a rag doll, he went limp and allowed them to push him into a cell. In the cell, Manus threw the blanket over his head and followed his breath. In the courtroom, the clerk threatened him with prison if he broke the conditions of his bail again. Manus was nonplussed by the threat. He stood there with something like indifference. This seemed to threaten the clerk or bother him. He said something about Manus's insolence and his non-compliance with the conditions of his bail. I was taking a child to nursery. There was an extremely heavy shower and I had to take shelter. I was 15 minutes late, Manus said. The clerk seemed more disgruntled and upset by the calm indifference of Manus's voice. The clerk's own voice seemed to lose its calm and calculation. This Irish itinerant! It wasn't even funny. The clerk's frustration and impotent anger at his inability to reach Manus. A juxtaposition from normality. The defendant stood in the dock was normally the one frothing at the mouth, but things didn't go normally. Manus pointed out that his nationality had little to do with his breaking of the bail. And since he actually had an address at the time, it was inaccurate to call him an itinerant. The clerk was irate by the end of it. Occasionally, even idiots like Manus could have moments of clarity, and such moments, when witnessed in places like courts, could cause mayhem. The clerk seemed to be frothing at the mouth as he repeatedly shouted to the magistrate, "Are you going to let this man go?" But the magistrate could find no logical reason not to, and Manus was allowed to leave, so long as he continued signing on at the cop shop every day at 9:30. Outside the courtroom, Manus bought a can of special brew. From the town where the court was, he walked down the canal to the next little town where he was living. The best thing about those towns was that they were small. You could walk out of them, look down on them from a hill, and see them for the little blots on the landscape that they were.